to Peace of Mind Radio Podcast. I am Brian Ramsey with Eric Douglas and Isaac LaFawn. How you guys doing today?
Doing well, man.
Cool. So today is, June 1st of 2020. And, of course, we're right in the middle of a pandemic. Last several weeks, that's kind of what we've been talking about, right? We talked about kind of market conditions and just kind of what's going on and that sort of thing. So this week we thought we would have a little change of pace. So this came about, we had a client meeting. This has been 2-3 weeks ago. And a client came in and said, hey, I've got this question. And so as we were meeting with the client, I sort of wrote down, hey, this would be a pretty cool podcast. So that's what I did. So anyway, the topic for today is, when is a good time to refinance your mortgage, or when should you consider it, and when, some things maybe you should look at and say, nah, maybe not is the right time to refinance. That's kind of what I want to walk through. Okay. So let's do this. Let's. What are y'all's initial thoughts when a client comes in and asks you about, refinancing or financing, or buying a house or refinancing a mortgage? What are some of the questions that you want to know that would give you an indication of how to, drill down on your conversation of whether they should refinance?
Well, I think one thing I want to know is how it fits to their budget, first and foremost. I mean, obviously we need the details of the mortgage, right? We need to know, what term they have when they bought it, what their interest rate is, all these different things. But one of the things I'm most concerned with is how big of a portion of your monthly mortgage payment, how much of that is in your budget? Is that representing 20% of your budget, or is that representing 35% of your budget, which would be astronomically high in that situation? But, ultimately one of the things that when our clients are coming in and that we spend a lot of time talking about and helping them analyze is whether or not they should look to be paying off their mortgages early. And if they do want to, divvy up some money to help pay that down a little bit more quickly, is that something that they should be looking at doing? And we can help run those calculations, but ultimately it's always a function of, how much of their budget is allocated towards their mortgage and how much more flexibility they might have to be able to divvy up some more toward that.
Yeah, we always start obviously in relation to the financial plan. So what's the goal surrounding their mortgage, at a high level, kind of to Eric's point? Are they trying to pay it off early? Are they trying to pay it off before they start saving for their kids' college? Where does that mortgage fall in the pecking order of other goals that they have? And then, of course, you pointed out too, Eric, getting the facts behind their current mortgage to understand what value there may be out there in a current market with interest rate and loan terms and that kind of thing. So like anything, you have to kind of do an audit of where they're currently sitting with their mortgage and the terms of that mortgage before you'd ever look at any other options.
Yeah, that's those are all good points. One of the things that we always talk about is sort of your debt schedule. We did a radio show on this, pretty popular. We had several folks call in about it, but we were talking about just the amount of your mortgage and the amount of your debt. This comes up in a little bit when we start talking about the points on things you should consider, and one of them is consolidation of debt, right? Taking out maybe high, credit card debt or something and refinancing. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but we certainly don't want to exceed the norms, which are, the standard 25 to 32% of your gross income is your debt schedule. So all that being said, what we're really trying to focus on here is when somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm considering refinancing, what are some of the things that we need to consider? All right, so let's just kind of run through them. I'll take the first one. So one of the things that is sort of a general thumb, and this goes back to even when I was in the banking business or worked at a bank, one of the general rules of thumb was, if your interest rate today or the interest rate you could be getting is at least 1% less than what you could be getting, it's probably a good time to refinance. Would you guys agree with that? Sort of what your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a pretty good rule of thumb, and especially in an interest rate environment where we're at now, where rates are historically low, with not really much room for them to go much lower than they already are, especially if you're looking to stay in your home for a long period of time, and that's probably something else that we need to make sure that we're incorporating when we're planning this out. But if you're going to be staying in your home for a long amount of time and you can lower an interest rate by at least 75 basis points, but definitely 1%, it's going to be worth it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. The effect that the interest rate has on your mortgage is pretty significant. So if there's any way that you can reduce it anything around 1%, that's going to drive a lot of savings for that.
See, I would agree with that, but also want to make sure that when you're talking about lowering your interest rate 1%, you have to know sort of what your goal is for living in that house, right? Because you can do the math all day long, and if you're not going to be there more than 2-3 years, I don't know that it's really worth it. It might be, but it might not be. And so I think you have to understand. You have to kind of look at the bigger picture. What you said a minute ago, Isaac. You got to do a wealth plan, right? You got to do your financial plan in order to know what your goals are with your primary residence. Because again, if it's 1% and you're not planning on being there very long, it may not be worth to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it may not make
Well, because
sense.
you always have to calculate what closing costs will be, and you're going to have to add that back into whatever you owe against your house. And if you're taking on a little bit more debt to cover closing costs just to save a few bucks a month, especially if, once again, if you're not going to be there for a long amount of time, it's probably not going to be worth it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So the second one that we kind of came up with, and by the way, I just Googled this and said, when is it a good time to refinance your mortgage? So some of these I do talk about, but there's a few in there that I thought, well, I don't know about that. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I kind of get where they were, the couple of articles I read, I kind of get where they're coming from. So I may not necessarily always agree with everything on this list, but I did want to bring it up because if you Google it, this is what's going to come up. So, we know people, Google things all the time. So I wanted to address them all. All right. So second one, reducing when your primary goal is to reduce your amortization schedule, reduce the amount of time your loan from a 30-year to 15-year. You guys think that's a good idea?
In and of itself, no. If that's the only goal that you have to achieve, I would say the answer would probably be no. And what I mean by that is if you have an opportunity to lower your interest rate and reduce that schedule, absolutely, that's a fantastic idea. But if you're just going to incur some additional closing costs to reduce the term of your loan from, let's say, a 30 to a 15 or whatever that number might be, there's nothing stopping you from throwing an extra couple $100 every month on your mortgage payment to pay that down earlier. It also allows you to maintain some flexibility in your monthly budget as well by having a 30-year monthly payment versus a 15-year monthly payment. So if something happens, and we're in a situation right now where we've had a lot of people lose their jobs. If you're in a situation where you go unemployed and you're losing your income stream, it certainly helps to have the flexibility of a lower monthly payment in some cases, by all means. So if you're not actually going to significantly reduce the amount of interest that you're paying, it's probably not worth it because you can do that in and of itself just by paying an additional, a few $100 a month. And actually, because I did mortgages for a few years when I came out of college, if you make one extra mortgage payment per year, and this is not including the amount of money that you would pay towards taxes and interest, taxes and insurance. If you strictly make one extra principal and interest payment per year, you're actually going to reduce a 30-year mortgage down to about a 22, 23-year term. So it's pretty powerful if you're just going to make that, one extra payment per year, or even going from doing something as simple as going from a monthly payment schedule to paying every 2 weeks. Because once again, that will actually add up to making one half payment every 2 weeks. And then when you account for the fact that you're making 26 payments versus 12, 26 half payments equals one additional total payment per year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you're at on if you're currently sitting in a 30-year mortgage, where are you at in that 30-year mortgage?
Right.
Because 30-year mortgages always have, we've talked a little bit about amortization schedule. For those that aren't aware, that's the schedule of what makes up the amount of your payment. You might have a $1,200 payment. What amount of that payment is principal? What amount of that is interest? On most 30-year mortgages, early in that mortgage, especially in the first 5 years, a lot of that payment, a majority of that payment is interest. So if you're 5-6 years down the road into a 30-year mortgage, you've already paid a lot of interest. So you kind of have that, in some ways, that's an advantage moving forward if, to Eric's point, you're going to pay extra on it. If you're going fresh into a mortgage, yeah, I mean, you can consider and weigh the options of having a more flexible payment, a lower payment, and everybody understands the relevance of that, how that might be beneficial in this little 6-month stretch of time that we're all living in right now. But, it makes more sense if you're doing it from scratch than it does in the middle of a 30-year, I would say. But first, the first thing is important, and I think, Eric, you said this, if you're going to move from a 30 to a 15 in the middle of that 30-year, you especially need to check a box that you're also saving significantly on the interest rate too. That's about the only way it would make sense.
Yeah, and typically you find in a 15-year, the bank doesn't have to, keep that money locked up for, or the collateral for as long on a 15-year, so you're going to get a lower interest rate anyway.
Correct.
On a 15-year. But okay, so here's another one, and this is a pretty interesting one. We don't see this a lot, but you will see this, especially if you listen to a guy on the radio that has a very similar name to me. He's all about paying down debt. And by the way, I'm not a beneficiary. I kind of wish I was, but I'm not.
Keep waiting for that.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, but it's. I think in some cases, it can make some sense to consolidate debt. So in other words, you got a mortgage, you have a line of credit, you have some credit card debt, and those typically lines of credit and credit card debt, which is unsecured debt, typically have a higher interest rate. So if you can, and your only situation is, better for you to consolidate that debt. And there's some strategies around that. We've had a couple clients do that in the past, and we've said, okay, just whatever your payment is that you've been making, continue to make that on your mortgage when you refinance that debt. So there's some strategies like that to help them pay off. But what do you guys think about what would you, if your client came in and said, hey, I've got some credit card debt, I've got a line of credit, and I'm getting a super low interest rate. I want to refinance, but it's essentially a consolidation loan or to consolidate into your mortgage. What are your thoughts on that?
I am very hesitant. A lot of red flags pop up whenever I talk to anybody about doing that, about consolidating debt within a mortgage, because not to say that it's always a bad idea, but you need to be super disciplined if you're going to take that type of a strategy and implement it, because what you don't want to have happen is take your credit card debt, student loans, any other kind of debt that you have that's on a specific amortization schedule as it is. You don't want to make sure you're taking credit card debt and refinancing credit card debt that you could have paid off in 5 years and trade that for a new 30-year mortgage that you're paying over a longer term. Just because the interest rate's going to be a little bit lower, well, the amount of interest that you're paying over a much longer period of time, it's probably not going to be worth it. So it's very, very important that if you are going to do that type of a strategy, that you're not adding on years to your existing mortgage, because you don't want to trade short-term debt for long-term debt.
Well, you also have to be pretty daggone disciplined to say if you're going to consolidate credit card debt so that you don't turn around and do it again.
Exactly. That's another really valuable point, because you got to change your spending habits before you implement a strategy like this. You really need to be very disciplined.
Yeah. Isaac, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it always comes back to like the value of a wealth plan or a financial plan, I think, because where we see it's not like when people come in with it and meet with us for any number of reasons, it's not like we suggest a lot of rocket science to them. A lot of it, like in their gut, there's kind of things they knew they should have been doing for a while. It's just this people have within our nature, like we just punt on stuff. There's always this inertia component to where we actually start doing the things that we want to do. So again, to Eric's point, if you're not disciplined, then it's not going to, all the goodwill and all the good strategy goes out the window anyways. And especially, again, to Eric's point before, having that flexibility of that payment, this is a similar situation. You do something for a good reason, and then you put yourself in a bind, and then you run into a circumstance like we are today. The wheels come off, and here we are again in 2 more years or less in the exact same boat, and you have less flexibility than you had before when you run into that same circumstance.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it really, if you think about it, any conversation that we have on this podcast, we're pretty much going to relate it back to do a financial plan, right? Because that's where you get your answers. And we've always said, any major financial decision, now, no, not going out and buying a TV, or no, that's not what we're talking about, but, buying a second home, refinancing your home, buying your first home, any kind of major financial decision, you got to get the information you need, or you got to get information in order to make an educated decision. You can't just go out and say, well, this is how I feel about it, without looking at the numbers, right? Because that's just not the proper decision-making process.
I mean, there's a principle in business called opportunity cost. And every time you make a decision, you're trading some opportunity for making that decision, even if it appears to be a no-brainer, right?
Right.
What's the possible loss here? Well, you're giving up some flexibility. Debt planning is really important. It's always all these good things that are available out there in the market today are all contingent on credit rating, history of doing good decisions. And you have to think about, well, if I do this, it removes the ability in some period of time, at least to protect my credit rating, that I have to avoid doing new things involving my credit for some period of time.
Yeah.
Well, that bleeds into whether or not you should actually pay your mortgage off early, right? Because when we talk about that a lot when we're putting together financial plans, and we actually have some software that can map out, okay, if you were going to dedicate this amount of money each month to pay off your mortgage, versus another amount of money and maybe contribute to something else on the side. We do a lot of that analysis, but to your point about opportunity costs, I mean, yeah, it's certainly possible to go ahead and make an additional $400 or $500 a month payment to your mortgage, for example, and get that thing paid off as quickly as you possibly can. But there is an opportunity cost involved there that you are not contributing to your retirement. And someone who's in their, let's say, early 50s, who's not contributing to their retirement funds, I mean, yes, it's always a wonderful thing to be able to pay off a mortgage, pay off your debt, and I never want to discourage that by any means, but you always need to weigh the possibility that whatever you're spending over here, you're not putting it over here. And so there is an opportunity cost there for not investing, towards your future and not, having any opportunity for long-term growth within your portfolio. You're eliminating a fixed cost, which would be your mortgage, but you're also eliminating an opportunity or reducing an opportunity for greater growth in your portfolio down the line.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, we'll certainly do a podcast on that because we did a radio show on that about a year or so ago, and it was, or maybe it's a couple of years ago now, but it was incredibly well received. I mean, we got a ton of phone calls when we brought that up because we're basically having conversations about topics that they never really considered. Right, so we'll make sure we do a show on that. Okay, all right, so the next one. Here's one that was on there that I don't really understand. I kind of get it, but it's taking equity out of your house for something else. And they listed a number of things on there. One was like doing rehab on your home, which I get that, but that's really more, you're essentially taking money out to improve the value of that particular asset. Which I understand that if you want to put an addition on your house or redo your bathroom, whatever, I get that part. The second one was that you take money out of your house to live on, which I thought was odd. But maybe I mean, if you needed access to cash, maybe that's one way to do it. But they did bring up two other topics, and I just want to get your all's thoughts on it. Number one was taking money out of your house to invest in a business, which I got a point about that. And then number two, taking money out of your house to use in your investment portfolio. So of those, and you guys can take, I know which one everybody's going to take here, but of those, I mean, would that ever be something that you would encourage a client to even potentially consider?
I would have a really hard time in good conscience recommending taking on debt to invest in any capacity without any type of a promise or guarantee of a return. That would be really difficult to do.
Okay, but here's the kickback. And part of this article that I was reading was it talks about, well, I can borrow money at X percent and I can make X percent in the market. That was the argument that this article was making about why you might consider doing that. I would never do that. I would never tell a client to do that, but I kind of get what they're saying.
Well, if someone read that article in January of 2020, right before the market dropped 30%.
Or how about July of 07?
Exactly, yeah. It's
That's an even better time, yeah.
I guess it would depend ultimately on what your investment goals are, and that would be a whole other discussion, but it would seem to me in 99% of the time, it would seem to me there's probably a better way to achieve your goals than increasing the amount of debt that you have to pay. It just seems like a really bad strategy to me to do a cash out refinance, take money out of the equity of your home and try to invest it, whether it's speculative or not, that's not really the point. You're trading, the security of not having any debt versus a potential of returns in the future. And it's plus not only that, you're taking on more debt, but now you're also having to pay interest on that debt as well, and it's just not always going to be worth it.
Yeah, I mean, as a professional, we always, when someone comes to us and they want us to help with their investments, right, we run them through risk tolerance questionnaires, and we want to measure, loss aversion, how afraid are they of losing, how willing are they to stretch to go earn money, and then education, right? So we run on like a 0, which is like no risk, to 100 scale, which is prospective type investment, speculative. And this would be like beyond speculative, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With protected money, it's dangerous to be very speculative with investing. If you were taking money out, taking on debt, basically taking out more debt to your, out of a property you already have, to then go try to make money, you have to push the limit to make it have made sense. But that's just very dangerous. I mean, that's putting people in a vulnerable position again. And like when you think about things, we run what we call Monte Carlo, stress test analysis on stuff. How would you even begin to quantify that? I mean, most of this stuff that we're talking about is all behavioral. Their ability, the achievable outcome of what's being talked about. You can run all the quantitative analysis all day, make a bunch of pretty spreadsheets, and at the end of the day, how likely is it that it actually happens? And that they still sleep with their head on the pillow at night with some reasonableness, and wake up happy and not, crying into their coffee instead of adding sugar, right?
Yeah. And even if it does happen, how much better off would you have been just sticking to a budget and investing the money that you do have wisely? It seems to me if you need to take on debt to invest, you're probably living beyond your means in some way, shape, or form. There's something else that needs to be addressed before going to that link to find some money to invest.
Yeah, here's one that over the years I've had 2 that I know of, clients that have leveraged their home to buy businesses. And I will tell you that in both cases, now it may not work out in every single case, but in both cases this made a ton of sense for them because they had to have access to equity. They didn't have it in their investment accounts. So one way to get at the money or to get access to capital in order to buy these two companies, they leverage their home up. That part I get, but boy, you have to be very careful even with that. But I will tell you that, if you listen to the guy on the radio who has the same name as me, he's going to say, absolutely, you're not ever doing that. But, and I agree, that is not what you want to do. But if that's an option and you've got a great opportunity to invest in what will wind up being, and in those 2 cases is definitely, and it is in my case, my company's my largest asset, right? So it made sense for the 2 of them to leverage up their home, take the equity out, and buy the company. So that I can see makes sense, but boy, none of the other ones. I don't know why you'd take money out to.
That one makes a lot more sense than, taking on more debt just to invest, generally speaking, because at least there's a specific purpose in mind. But if you were going to do that, I would make sure that you know what your business plan is, that you have a very specific use of the money, and you know what the goal is, you know what the end result looks like, because that's still pretty speculative. Not to say that it's, there's certainly people that do that, and the people that are betting on themselves are going to be high risk takers inherently because you're, investing in a business, you're investing in yourself. And I understand that mentality. I mean, we're all small business owners here, of course, but it's still a lot of risk. Let's not.
It is, but it's different if you take money out to invest in a company where it's your profession.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Versus I'm going to take money out and I'm going to go invest in a snow cone, stand out in Crestwood, or I'm going to open up a sandwich shop or something. That's totally different. Both of these scenarios I'm talking about, these were these guys' professions, right?
Yeah.
And they were already operating a small business and they got an opportunity to buy a larger competitor in both scenarios. So that made a ton of sense, right? There was no business plan to put together because they were already in the business. Mm-hmm. But I get your point. If you're just winging it going, hey, I don't know, I sold cell phones my whole life and now I'm going to go I got an opportunity to buy into a CPA practice. I'm not sure that's going to work. I wouldn't do that.
Go buy a franchise or something like that. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So once again, that's going to be a very specific, very specific situation. But not to say it doesn't make sense. It definitely could. And if you're betting on yourself, that's certainly probably a better bet than betting on the market.
Yeah. All right, so here's another one that we talked about right before we were shooting this podcast. We talked about refinancing your mortgage, and we talked about there's costs associated with that. It's not free, and I will tell you, I hear this on the radio all the time. refinance your mortgage with us or buy a new home with us, and there is zero closing costs. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's free. Getting a mortgage is free. You just show up and they give you a mortgage and you just start making your payment. It doesn't cost you anything. And I just want to go, surely nobody falls for that. I mean, there are people that do. I get it. But you have to understand it's costing you something somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. It's usually in your interest rate. So just make sure if you are refinancing your house, make sure you shop around. That's the best idea I can give everybody. Just call 4 or 5 places and see who has the better deal. They're all going to pretty much be about the same, right? You run the business. So to some degree, they may price it to where they slow their mortgage volume down a little bit. They'll price it up a little bit. And if they're trying to get mortgages, they'll price it down some, price the interest rate down to kind of attract the business. But for the most part, they're all about the same. So with that being said, there's a cost to refinancing, right? So you're going to have, I will tell you, I just refinanced my house back in January, and I literally looked at my closing costs, and outside of my prepaids, so there were some prepaids like insurance and taxes. Once you take that out, my closing cost is about $1,700. Okay, so I did it. I looked at it and said, what's my payback period for that $1,700? Now, what I mean by payback period is if I'm paying $1,700, I got to be able to recoup that in the form of a lower interest rate, right? So I just did the math and was like, okay, it cost me $1,700. I went from 3.875, which is where I was on adjustable rate, but I went from 3.875 to 3%. Okay, and I kept my term the same. So my year's amortization schedule didn't change. It changed maybe 2 years, but that's a different story. All right. So when I did that, all I did was take the interest that I was saving, the interest I was saving divided by the $1,700, and I came out with 18 months. So as long as I'm going to stay in that home for at least 18 months, I'm better off to go ahead and refinance, right? So how do you guys address the cost of refinancing your mortgage with your clients?
I mean, it's always important with anything to look at total cost.
Yep.
Like if I just ran it all the way out, what am I paying in total, right? And then weigh that against the other option. What does it look like if I, refinance it and then run it out from that point in time? What's the total cost? And you were right to point out there is a seesaw, right, of interest rate and closing costs. It's the same way when you go and buy a house and the seller's like, I'll pay the closing costs, no big deal. That's fine. You paid $5,000 more for the house. And people are willing to take on more debt to avoid $5,000 outlay of cash.
Right.
And so that's kind of always the thing. You can always negotiate with a bank on closing costs. If you got good credit, they're going to say, sure, no big deal. We'll cover the closing costs, but your interest rate just went up. And it's always that seesaw. So you always want to look at what the total cost, the amount paid over that mortgage. And you have to evaluate it that way, compare apples to apples.
Well, one thing I will tell you, so I did the same thing, right? I'm a numbers guy just like you guys are, so I analyze it 500. I probably, in some cases, overanalyze.
A little more than we are, to be honest.
Yeah, so wait till next week, which is a great intro. So next week, we're recording another podcast. Well, actually, we're going to do it right after this one, but it'll air the following week. But I asked myself a question. I was looking to buy a new truck, and I said, what is this thing actually costing me? So I did the numbers, and you got to tune in next week to hear that. It's pretty amazing. All right, so when I looked at my to cover the closing costs, it was about 18-month payback, and so I knew from that perspective it made sense. And then I was just curious, like, what am I saving over the course of my loan? Now, this is a little bit unique in that I didn't do this over the course of 15 years. Because I went from like 17 to 15. It's a long story how I got there. But on my 15 years, I have zero plans to stay in that house for 15 years. Okay, so I got a little kid. He's going into 5th grade. And I told him, I said, dude, the day you leave for college, when you come see me, you're going to a different address, my man. It's not going to be here. It's going to be somewhere else. They get a big kick out of that. But so I know my window's 10 years, right? I got about a 10-year window, no more than 10 years. So I just ran the numbers and said, what am I actually saving if I refinance and I pay my mortgage over 10 years? Now, to your point, Eric, I don't pay one penny more on my mortgage every month. I don't. we'll get to that in another podcast. But I know that I'm not going to be here more than 10 years. So I just ran the math. So my current mortgage over my 10 years, I would have paid $49,301. $301. Yeah, play plural, isn't it? I think it is. Well, it's $1. Anyway.
We trust you.
Yeah, okay. So $49,300 over that period, I would have paid in interest. By refinancing, now my interest is $32,571. So I looked at it and said, well, not only am I saving X amount of dollars per month, but I'm also saving over the course of my loan about $17,000, pretty close to it. So again, another way to analyze it. Again, I'm not staying there 15 years. I know I'm not. But about 10 years, and I'm staying there because my kids go to school in my district, but that's a whole different story. But I know that I'm there for at least 10 years. That's in my plan. And I'm saving about $16,000 to refinance. So again, in my case, made all the sense in the world for me to refinance. Mm-hmm. But that may not, that may not be everybody's case because you may not be a 10-year stay in your home.
Yeah, I just don't think you can allow, there's the kind of like the fear of missing out. I remember when my wife and I we've been married 13 years, and I think we've been married 3 or 4 years, and interest rates were pretty decently low at that time. And we had our first couple good jobs, and everybody's like, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go buy a house,
right?
Because rent, you don't get anything out of your rent. But if you actually run the math, it was better for us to save money. And then, you're always, again, back to the, opportunity cost. You don't know what the interest rate will be in the future, but it doesn't seem that you're going to miss out on, the rates going through the roof anytime soon. So again, don't let a situation, advertising and
right.
disillusion that you have to do this refinance now, or that opportunity may not be there. So you did a good, you went about it the right way. No surprise, Brian, and just kind of ran the numbers. It's a little easier for us, I think, to keep it really sterile,
right?
Where we're a little bit ridiculous in that way, that we just run the numbers and we go, that's what it says to do, and so we'll do it, no problem. But I think for other people, you need to have a conversation. And what we haven't mentioned yet is oftentimes there's a spouse involved.
Right.
Both parties need to be on the same page with any kind of stuff like this, and there needs to be agreement. And that, again, through a good planning process does help, kind of flesh out any concerns or things that the other party may have that are really important to consider.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that you kind of poke fun at me and my numbers. So this is a conversation I have with clients a lot, and it can have an effect when you're refinancing your property or your primary residence or even a second residence. And that is, we all have a tendency to look at the here and now, and we look at how's this affecting me today, and we don't look at how's this affecting me 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And we preach that, right? I mean, I've been in meetings with all of you guys, and we all say it. Yeah, okay, contributing to this or doing this or, making this particular decision. You understand what the impact is to you today, but you got to see what it is down the road. Here's the deal. When I refinanced my mortgage, I knew that my payment was going to go from X to X, because that's the moment right there, right? That is how it affects me today. But what I wanted to know was, how does this affect me 10 years from now? What does everything look like? Because I know what my loan balance is going to be, right? But I wanted to see how this was going to impact me financially. And the real impact is I'm paying $16,000 less, because my payment didn't change a whole lot. That's a whole different story. But my interest rate alone, I'm saving $13,000, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So what can I do with $13,000? Now I'll save a little bit here and there. It doesn't all come at one time, but over the course of 10 years, saving $13,000 is a pretty big deal, right? So you got to look at refinancing. Yes, in here now, what's it going to do to your current payment? But you need to see the impact 10, 15, 20 years from now. That's the point. We all had that conversation, but that's kind of why we're weirdo number people, is because we do look at things like that.
Yeah, and he who shall not be named that has a similar name than you also would say, based on zero, making sure you have every dollar allocated. It's a good principle in this situation. I feel like you can run yourself into the grave going too nuts with it.
Yeah.
But if you do this in the name of saving $13,000 and you spend that $13,000, to Eric's point, you don't have a good budget in place. And it just, because $13,000 over 10 years can kind of just drift into Taco Bell
It
or
can.
some garbage spending, and
Yeah.
really you really have no benefit.
That's right.
You have no benefit. So if you don't actually plan for what you do with that money in a meaningful way, you really haven't done much. I mean, odds are if you don't allocate it towards something, it's just you're not gonna be able to look back 10 years later and say, well, what did I do with that?
Yeah. All right. So one last, which I found this one, and I thought this was an interesting one, but I kind of somewhat get it. Refinancing your property, going from either an adjustable rate mortgage to a fixed mortgage, or from a fixed to adjustable, depending on what the scenario is. This article actually claimed, I saw it in two different places, that if you're refinancing your property going from an adjustable to a fixed, that it was a bad idea. Both of them said that. But I can also see where it's a smart idea, right? Especially if you're going to be there for a long term. Now, if you're only going to be there 5 years, nah, because interest rates over the next 5 years clearly being with what we've been through, I don't foresee them, going up significantly. But going from an adjustable rate where your payment could potentially change over the course of your loan, to a fixed rate where you can actually budget for it, to me, I thought was a good idea. That's why I kind of listed it here. But what are your thoughts around that when you have somebody that has maybe an adjustable rate and they're considering refinancing to a fixed rate?
It ultimately depends on what the plan is. How long are you going to live in your house? That ultimately is what it will boil down to most of the time. It's not purely a financial decision, although it's obviously it is a financial decision. But ultimately it depends on what your goals are. And if you can lock in at today's interest rates a really good fixed interest rate for 15, 20, 30 years, whatever amount of time it might be, it's just a matter of how comfortable are you rolling the dice. Because if you're going to take out an adjustable rate mortgage, yes, I don't think that interest rates are going to be changing much in our current environment over the next couple of years. But if you get a 5-year adjustable rate mortgage, I don't know what's going to happen in 4 or 5 years. Nobody does.
Yeah.
We can make educated guesses, but ultimately nobody knows. And if you have an ability to lock in a 3-4% interest rate for 30 years, that's not a bad deal, and that's not something that you will probably ever regret.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything terribly new to add to the matter. I think it's all about the terms. Like, what do you currently have? I mean, you just run a proper evaluation on it.
Right.
This is where I think running the numbers is like incredibly crucial. I'll just say though, like a lot of this comes down to kind of where you're throwing darts at where you think things are going.
Yeah.
And I feel like for the last 10 years, it's been you have to capitalize on the current interest rate. I mean, we've been at a historically low interest rate for a while, and somehow we found a way to get lower, which is pretty interesting. But it doesn't seem like the Fed is thinking about, I can't see a situation where the interest rate gets back to where it was, where it used to be 10, 15% on these kind of things. So
well, it's interesting because we mentioned I did mortgages right out of college. That was my first job out of school, and this was 04, 05, and we were dealing with 5.5%, 6.5% interest rates, and those were historically low interest rates at the time. and I remember at one point, getting people 5% rates, and I kept telling people, lock it in, lock this rate in. You're never going to get anything better, because at the time there was never anything better. At that time, 5% interest rates on a fixed mortgage were historically low. Fast forward a few years, and a 5% interest rate. If anyone, if you tell anybody you have a 5% interest rate now, they're gonna ask you, why the heck haven't you refinanced yet?
Bad credit.
Yeah, it may be.
Bad credit's why you still got 5%.
Yeah.
Or a couple of slow pays. Okay. All right. So that's pretty much. Let's just go ahead and wrap it up for the day. Unless you guys have anything you want to add here at the very end.
Nope.
All right. Cool. Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to. So next week we're actually going to record the show right after this one. But next week we're going to talk about what it actually costs you to own a car. When you go buy your car, what it ultimately costs you, and the answer will be shocking. Because I did the numbers, and we're going to walk through it next week. So
yeah, especially if you buy something that's extremely fuel efficient.
Right. Well, mine's not.
What the example Brian's going to go through is about a very fuel efficient vehicle, right?
Yeah, it is. That's right. Yeah, eats 15 miles a gallon or something. But anyway, all right. Well, listen. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for listening to our podcast. Again, if you like our content, make sure you share it. And make sure you subscribe to our channel. We're doing content once a week, and we'll see you guys next week. And we're talking about what it costs to buy a car.
Appreciate it.
Yep. Everybody have a good one.
Thanks.
IFP and Family Wealth Planning Partners are not affiliated. The information given herein is taken from sources that IFP Advisors, LLC, doing business as IFP, IFP Securities, LLC, doing business as IFP, and its advisors believe to be reliable, but it is not guaranteed by us as to accuracy or completeness. This is for informational purposes only, and in no event should be construed as an offer to sell or solicitation of an offer to buy any securities or products. Please consult your tax and/or legal advisor before implementing any tax and/or legal related strategies mentioned in this publication, as IFP does not provide tax and/or legal advice. Opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not take into account the particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of individual investors.